The phrase jack of all trades, the full version is actually jack of all trades, master of none, oftentimes better than master of one. But I think it's culturally telling that we hacked off the back end.
What do you say to those people who feel that real pressure to specialize?
This is like really a sort of neuroses that's like running under even the highest achievers, thinking that because they didn't stick with the first thing they ever tried, that they'll be behind forever. And that's totally not how it is.
This is David Epstein.
Author David Epstein.
David Epstein.
I'm David Epstein.
He's a best-selling author, a science journalist, and the man behind the groundbreaking book, Range. He spent years studying performance, high achievement, and why everything we've been told about success is wrong.
10,000 hours rule supposes that there is no such thing as talent. And I'm seeing this research that's saying that's just not true. None of them really did do 10,000 hours. If you frame it in the sense that I should pick a thing and despite what I learn, I should stick to it, then it sounds stupid.
What is the difference between strategic quitting and just giving up?
I think quitting needs a rebrand because
This conversation with David Epstein wasn't meant to be released. In fact, it was recorded as research for our last video, but after seeing the insane growth that our team has had from this interview alone, it felt wrong not to share it with you all. In this conversation, we're not just going to discuss what it takes to be successful, but we're going to discuss the lies that we have been fed about success. And it's going to challenge everything that we've seen online, on social media, or in any podcast when it comes to what it takes to actually become a successful individual. So here it is. This is David Epstein, and this is the anatomy of a dream. First off, I have to say this because you were just one of the coolest people that not only did this book change my life in so many ways a couple years ago, but reading it again, I think there's so many new things that I've taken away that have just given me a whole new meaning, especially for this channel, which is the anatomy of a dream. And I know there's a lot of different parts of the book that just really challenge the way that our whole team is now really assessing and how we look at the anatomy of a dream. And so I just want to thank you for that, because it really meant so much to us. And to have you here is very, very, very much a very big thing for us. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
in case it makes you feel any better, I get nervous for almost every interview I ever do. Doesn't matter who it is. And I also am constantly in this state of like not knowing exactly who I am or what I'm doing. So over time, I've learned that doesn't go away, just that it also doesn't have to stop you from doing any of those things. But you learn to habituate to that like feeling of discomfort a little bit when you're doing something new.
Yeah, no, thank you for saying that. That is, I think, really an important fact, and it kind of just shows you that you're in the right rooms, probably. Yes, I mean, I really do want to start off with why explore generalization versus specialization. You know, writing a book is not an easy feat. So to spend as much time as you did with this particular subject, why this topic, and why did you think it was important?
Honestly, it first grew out of a debate that I was having with Malcolm Gladwell that was specifically about sports. Like, I had criticized some of his writing about the 10,000 hours rule, you know, the need to focus really narrowly and really early and just pick something and stick with it. And we came together for a debate the first time we ever met. And in that debate, I talked about just some of the data in sports showing that, in fact, those kind of Tiger Woods stories of super early specialization are the exception, not the norm, and showed some data to that effect. And we were coming off the stage. He said, you know, that doesn't fit with what I've written. That's interesting. Like, do you want to run tomorrow? We were both competitive runners. Do you want to run tomorrow and talk about it? And so it became like a point of sort of personal debate on our runs. And pretty soon we got bored of sports and we're thinking, well, what about all these other areas of the world? You know, when does it make sense to be more narrow and specialized versus when does it make sense to build a broad toolbox and have broad experiences? And around that same time, I gave a talk to just a tiny group of former Navy SEALs, like maybe 12 of them or something. And they had transitioned out of the military and were, you know, in grad school or other jobs. And again, I talked just a little bit about some of the data I'd been compiling for my basically personal discussions with Malcolm Gladwell, about how actually this sort of winding path and diverse experiences can be an asset, especially in a world that demands kind of flexible problem solving. And they were like, I think one of them was like in tears, you know, because these were people that had these incredible experiences. They were in like elite grad schools now. They had been in special forces. And they were so worried that they were behind because they had spent this time in the military doing things that, you know, gave them incredible skills and experiences. And when I saw that and recognized I myself have changed careers a few times and have felt very self-conscious about it, but eventually realized that it was a strength rather than a weakness. And I saw that reaction in these people who were these unbelievably exceptional performers and yet so anxious about the idea they were behind compared to their peers. I just started to think, gosh, this is like really a sort of neuroses that's like running under even the highest achievers, thinking that because they didn't stick with the first thing they ever tried, that they'll be behind forever. And I'm seeing this research that's saying that's just not true. And so I figured if I kind of felt that way, and these people felt that way, there must be a lot of people out there feeling that way.
No, that's a very powerful part of the book. I by the way, I ran out of my green highlighter, which was only supposed to be used for very important parts I wanted to bring up in the interview, and the whole book is green. So that part really was one of the standout parts, because it, I think, confirms that we're not alone in this feeling and how many people experience it. But I think the Tiger and Roger story that you chose to start with in the book was incredibly telling. And I think was the perfect example. I really tried to think of another comparison that was better than that, and there isn't. I haven't been able to think of it. We tried. If you can, explain to those that are watching, you start off your work with Tiger versus Roger. If you could just enlighten us a little bit more with that discovery of those two individuals.
Yeah, I mean, the Tiger Woods story, I think I wanted to start with that because this is a book about personal development. That's like the subtext of the whole book. And in my mind, Tiger Woods' developmental path has been the single most impactful modern story of development. Like, it is seeped into our cultural consciousness to an extent that people who don't care anything about golf or even sports still know that here was this little kid who was an exceptional golf player, who started playing from a really early age. Like, his father famously gave him a putter at 7 months old. At 10 months, he started showing off a swing. By the time he was 2, you go on YouTube now and see a clip of him at age 2 on national television showing off his swing. And if anyone's met like a normal 2-year-old, you know how unusual that is. By the time he's 3, he's saying, I'm going to be the next great golfer in the world, right? And then you fast forward to the age of 21, and that's in fact what he was. So it was this incredibly tidy story of having this head start with an incredible amount of practice, a lot of intensity, and you become the best ever at the thing you're doing. And that image of that, 2-year-old and then becoming the greatest golfer in the world, it's such a powerful story that I think it just became so widespread and kind of a model for how people and parents of young kids decided development should work. Now, on the other hand, I wanted to contrast that by telling the story of Roger Federer, which is quite different, where he played a whole bunch of different sports as a kid. His mom was actually a tennis coach, but she declined to coach him because he didn't want to sort of focus on technical practice. He just wanted to goof around. He played some rugby, handball, volleyball, skateboarding, basketball, swimming, skiing, soccer. I'm sure I'm forgetting some, but a ton of different sports, table tennis. Actually, when his coaches started identifying him as talented and say, hey, we want to move you up to play with older boys, he declined because he just wanted to talk about pro wrestling with his friends after practice. Like, he was not super intense. He wasn't like Tiger, where at age 3, he's saying, I'm going to be the next greatest in the world. In fact, when he became good enough to warrant an interview with his local newspaper, and the reporter asked if he ever became a pro athlete, what would he buy with his first paycheck? And he said, a Mercedes. And his mother was like appalled to hear that. And, she didn't want him putting all his eggs in that basket. And she asked the reporter if she could listen to the interview recording. And it turned out Roger had said mehr CDs in Swiss German. He just wanted more CDs, not a Mercedes. His mother was fine with that, right? Like, he didn't have this perfect vision of the future. And obviously, Roger Federer, who ended up specializing later than a bunch of his peers, and played a wider variety of sports, turned out pretty good. And he's every bit as famous as Tiger Woods as an adult. And yet even tennis enthusiasts don't usually know anything about his developmental story, even though according to the science, it's the norm. And the Tiger story is the one that's the exception, not the other way around. And so I thought here are two figures that are instantly recognizable to most people. They kind of know one story. The other they don't, even though they know the person. And so it's sort of perfectly emblematic of how we've switched what we think is the exception and the norm. And And so I thought it was a great entry point or sort of analogy to all these other areas of life.
But why is that? Why do we stick to that being the preference, Tiger's story?
Yeah, it's a good question. I asked Malcolm Gladwell that when we would go on our runs, and he said, well, you go on YouTube and you see Tiger at 2 years old on national television, and it's like a human cat video. It's just like you can't look away and you have to send it to all your friends, so it spreads that way. I think there's some truth to that. But my opinion is that the real reason is that it feels like this incredibly tidy narrative that we can extrapolate to anything that we want to be good at in our own lives. It's like, look, this worked. If I just do that in whatever it is that I want to be good at, it'll work in that too. And the problem is, I think that's actually well-meaning. I think that sort of speaks well about people's intentions. They're like, I want to start, I want to work hard, and that's great. But I also think it's a really important mistake because extrapolating from this golf story, golf is like, in many ways, almost a uniquely horrible model of everything else that humans want to learn. It's the epitome of what the psychologist Robin Hogarth called a kind learning environment, meaning the next steps and goals are totally clear. The rules are clear and don't change. Patterns repeat. There's not a ton of human dynamics involved, relatively speaking. Feedback is quick and accurate. Work next year will look like work last year. So that's that kind learning environment. The problem is most of the areas that most of us work in, and increasingly so, are what Hogarth called wicked learning environments, where you may have to figure out the next steps and goals. They're not just handed to you. If there are rules, there may not be rules, and if there are, they may change. You can't just rely on repetitive patterns. Lots of human dynamics are involved. Feedback could be delayed or inaccurate, and work next year may not look like work last year. And increasingly, that's the world most of us are having to spend a lot of time in. And in that world, that really narrow specialization approach can often backfire really badly because what you need to do is be nimble and flexible and have a broad toolbox. So I basically think we took this really tidy, kind of comforting, easy to understand story and unfortunately applied it in areas of life that are not so static. And that's what I think is a big mistake.
The kind and the wicked learning environment, I think that was one of the frameworks that changed how I honestly understood and differentiated ourselves from Tiger Story. And I think that is an incredibly important thing for people to understand because, again, we are so persistent and adamant about comparing ourselves to what's easy to understand about Tiger Story. And especially when I think about our industry, that, the entertainment business is no longer even remotely the same as what it was when I started, right?
I think when our maybe parents or grandparents give us the advice to sort of pick something early and stick with it, I think that actually made sense for some previous generations when there was a period in our economy where people could kind of have a period of training or education and then a whole lifetime basically of working based on that training or education. They didn't really have to change so much. Their work didn't change that much year from year to year. People didn't move between companies or jobs as much. And so maybe that advice made sense for that time. But then you fast forward to the information age or knowledge age or creativity age, whatever you want to call, like kind of the last 40 or 45 years, basically. And now it's like very few people can have this period of training early in life and then expect to just work off of that for the rest of their life. Even if you're staying roughly in the same industry as maybe you are, what you're actually doing has to change probably a whole bunch of times over the course of your career. And to your point about that kind wicked framework, I mean, it came out of a confusion for me where I was reading all this literature on expertise. And there was one camp that was sort of led by some famous scientist that was saying, hey, if people do the Tiger thing and they drill down and lots of repetition, they get better. And then this other camp of also famous scientists that was saying, you know what, when people do the same thing over and over, actually, often they don't get better, but they do get more confident if it's too narrow, which is a bad mix. Some cases, they even get worse. And I'm like, both of these camps are these really esteemed scientists. Why are they finding such different results? And that's what Robin Hogarth was explaining with the kind, wicked learning environment, that it depended on the kind of tasks that they were studying, about whether people got better with this incredibly narrow practice. Whether it was golf or chess or something like that. Like chess, You got to specialize early. You have to start studying patterns by the age of 12, or your chance of reaching international master status drops from like 1 in 4 to 1 in 55. You got to do it. But it's based on repetitive patterns. Most of the things that we do are not like that. And so we have to be ready for this world where we can't expect to do the same thing like for the rest of our lives. And in that situation, you want this really broad toolbox that's like flexible to do what psychologists call transfer, which is transfer means taking your skills and knowledge and applying them to problems that are not exactly the one that you've seen in the past. And that's where people with this broader toolbox and broader experiences really excel. And increasingly, that is the work world for most people.
You touched upon, like our grandparents' generation. Around that time, specialists were almost needed for innovation somewhat back then. And now as we have AI, we have all of this different technology that can do the tactics for us. It's kind of changed that. So can you touch a little bit about how specialists in terms of like innovation back then, that might be something that potentially we almost stick to being innovation for the present?
That's an interesting point that you make. And, I don't mean to denigrate specialists. Like in the scope of centuries of economic development, specialization has been tremendously important. I think it's just that we've kind of gone overboard on it. And that has, one, created some problems, but also created tremendous opportunities for people who can connect dots, that aren't so narrow. I mean, if you look at like patent research, for instance, in a lot of the 20th century, the most impactful patents were often authored by, and patent research is a good way to look at innovation because it's like easily measurable, huge data sets. The most impactful patents were authored by people in teams that kind of drilled deeper and deeper into sort of one area of technology as classified by the patent office. But then you fast forward to, basically the computer age, where suddenly it's a lot easier to be broader than a specialist because you can access information so much more broadly. And you see this switch to the most impactful patents coming from teams that include people who worked in a whole bunch of different technological classes. And they're kind of this like bridge for people with different expertise, or they're understanding some technology that might be kind of taken for granted in one area. And they say, I can apply it over in this other area. And so you see this shift to people who kind of have a broader view about taking tools and moving them to address a new problem. And that's much more the world we are in today, where, and I think, again, I don't think that it means we don't need specialists, but I think AI is exacerbating some of that in the sense that it can do some of the repetitive stuff. It can access a lot of specialized knowledge. And so like a lot of technological disruptions of the past, it shifts people up to this like larger strategic level of thinking. And I think it's going to do that again. Since you mentioned tactics, right? One of the things I write about in the book that I think serves as a good analogy is what's called freestyle chess. So in 1997, IBM's supercomputer Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov in chess. And it was obviously a huge deal. Chess was viewed as like the epitome of human cognition. The Newsweek cover at the time, I have a copy of, it was as The Brain's Last Stand in 1997, right? Like, I don't know why any of us have any work anymore. That was The Brain's Last Stand. And the reason Deep Blue beat Kasparov was because it was so much better than him at tactics, basically memorizing, going through these small patterns of a few moves. That's what he had spent his life memorizing, but the computer was better at going through those because it had this incredible computation capacity. So those are called tactics, these small groups of moves. And it was so much better at that it beat him. But he noticed that the computer was not as good at strategy, which is kind of like, how do you arrange all the little battles to wage the war? How do you connect the dots of all your different tactics? And so after this loss, he promoted what he called freestyle chess tournaments, where humans could play alone, computers could play alone, humans and computers could play together, whatever. Anyone could play in any arrangement they wanted. And the winners were neither supercomputers, nor grandmaster players, nor grandmasters with supercomputers. The winners were 2 amateur chess players with 3 laptops. Like, they knew something about chess, and they knew something about algorithmic search, and they could handle this stream of information and coach the computers where to look. Like their winner's press conference was kind of funny because they didn't understand chess at a deep enough level to really analyze their own gameplay. But the really interesting thing there, these human-computer chess partnerships, by the way, which were playing the highest level of chess ever seen, were called centaurs, like half chess beast, half man. And I think the really interesting thing there is that when the tactics were outsourced, like the repetitive part of the task, or the raw computation part of the task was outsourced, suddenly the humans who were the best at chess were totally different. Like it was no longer Kasparov. Now it was these people with a much broader mix of skills and this strategic higher level view. And I think that's what we keep seeing in technological innovation. There's actually an example. I was looking at news coverage from the early 70s when ATMs first came online in the United States. And the news coverage is kind of catastrophic. It's like, hey, there were about 300,000 bank tellers in the US at the time. And the coverage is like they're going out of business overnight. This machine does their job. And instead what happened over the next 40 years, there were actually more bank tellers as there were more ATMs because ATMs made each branch cheaper to operate. So banks opened more branches, so there are fewer tellers per branch, but more branches overall. But more interestingly than that is it fundamentally changed the job of someone who was just doing repetitive cash transactions all day long to someone who's now like a marketing professional, a customer service rep, a financial advisor, like this much broader mix of what sometimes a lot of people call soft skills. I think of as durable skills because they never go out of fashion. And I think that's what we've often seen with technological disruption is it shifts the human to this higher strategic level of thinking, which is scary when you get shifted, but that's actually more interesting and where we have more value to add. So I think technological disruption is frightening, but it also presents a lot of opportunities for humans to do more of the stuff that they're uniquely good at.
This is so fascinating to hear, and I think that I don't know. Again, there's so much debate with AI and all of that, especially in the creative community of just what it's going to mean for us. And I think hearing that it just is empowering and reaffirming to just assure people that at the end of the day, it'll allow us to do our job best as long as we are flexible and we have that range and we're able to understand how. I feel like that example, especially with chess, is also another way where it's like thinking about understanding strategy is super pivotal. And it also begs the question for me, is there a case to be made for the specialist? I know that we're not, putting them down here, but I am curious, like, what is the case to be made for the specialist? Where do they shine most? And how do we know when that's the better path?
Yeah, great question.
Before we get back to the conversation, I want to thank today's sponsor, Bizly. If you're a jack of all trades like me, you probably have more than one skill set to show off. Bizly makes it simple to pull all of those pieces together and to present your work all in one place. It's as easy to update as your social media, but it's built to showcase your portfolio like a website. The best part is it's free. So come on home to Bizly. Link is in the description or it's on this QR code somewhere here. All right, let's get back to the conversation.
There are areas like, where you need somebody to dive deep and create like a new sliver of knowledge, for example. Like that's absolutely, so to go back to innovation, for example, and technological innovation, most of the innovation now comes from like someone either moving a piece of technology over somewhere else, sort of connecting things from different realms, or taking a solution from one industry and bringing it over to another. That said, there is still innovation that comes from people just drilling really deeply into like one segment of a specific technology and creating something new. So I think you need both of those. Or in the language of Freeman Dyson, who was one of the most important physicists in the world in the 20th century and was like a beautiful writer, he said we need both birds and frogs for a healthy ecosystem. And he was talking about like math and science specifically, but I think you can think of this in terms of everything. And he said the frogs are kind of down in the mud looking at the granular details of problems. The birds are soaring up above. They're not seeing those granular details, but they're connecting all the knowledge of the frogs. And we need both. If we want a healthy ecosystem, we need both. He said the problem is we're telling everyone to become frogs. And that's really short-sighted because then we don't have these people connecting the dots. So I think we need both. I think we've over-indexed on one. And I think the challenge is that really narrow specialization is often an under-recognized double-edged sword. So to give an example, like if I were listening to me, I think the elephant in the room is medicine, right? I think it would be crazy to say that increasing specialization hasn't been useful and important in medicine. It's been both inevitable and beneficial, increasing specialization in medicine. At the same time, even there, it's been really an under-recognized double-edged sword, to the point where there were 2 Harvard-led studies that found that if you're checked into a teaching hospital on the dates of a national cardiology convention when like the most esteemed specialists are away, you're actually less likely to die. And that's obviously a suboptimal outcome. And the researchers concluded that's because these specialists had gotten so used to doing certain procedures over and over and over and over that they would keep doing them even if they weren't the right solution to the problem, or if new data showed they didn't work or were harmful. So this is what psychologists call the Einstellung effect, where you've solved a problem a certain way so many times that you'll keep solving problems that way, even if the problem has changed or your tool is shown not to work. So, or as people might know more colloquially, it's like when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It's basically that problem. And that's not to say that those cardiologists are not important. Like sometimes they create new areas of knowledge or new techniques or new tools. The challenge is just they also fall prey to this cognitive entrenchment where they then become so attached to those things that they use them even when they're not the right thing to use. So I think we need those people that are drilling down and you know, seeing all these unusual cases of some area of technology or medicine. But I think there's some negative effects when we don't kind of mitigate that narrow specialization. I once gave a talk very nervously about range to a group of what the surgeon and writer Atul Gawande would call the proverbial left ear surgeons. Like these were people who were super specialized. There aren't left ear surgeons. He just uses that as a joke. And in that conference, I talked about some of the data that showed that specialized surgeons have fewer complications. That's good. Even if you control for the number of times that surgeons have done a certain procedure, the ones who self-identify as more specialized have fewer complications still. So it's not even just the number of reps they have. It's like something about, I don't know, maybe they're obsessing more. Who knows? Something about their identification as being more specialized means fewer complications. But they're also much more likely to do the procedure when it isn't needed, or to continue to do the procedure even if new data has shown it actually never worked at all. And so you get this kind of double edge. And even those specialized surgeons in that room, I thought, I was trying to be provocative, but I thought they were going to be really mad. And they loved it. They were like, we totally recognize this is a problem. We can see it in the research that there's a lot of unnecessary surgery done, which means you get complications that you didn't need to have. And we mostly think it's our colleagues, basically. So it was this interesting situation where they acknowledged the problem, but they kind of didn't think it was them. That could be true. Like these are people who came to a professional development conference. Maybe they are better, but more likely it's just that everyone is prone to cognitive bias. And when you're really narrowly focused, it's hard to recognize some of those cognitive biases in yourself.
One of the things that I think anyone that reads this is going to be mind blown by, because it's such a general phrase that we just say all the time. You haven't gotten your 10,000 hours yet. I'd love for you to, tell us a little bit about that and deliberate practice when it comes to specialization and your findings with it.
So when I wrote my first book, I realized that there were problems with the 10,000 hour rule research to begin with. Like, I don't think most people know this, but it's based on a tiny study of violinists, like 30 violinists, the 10 best of whom had practiced about 10,000 hours of so-called deliberate practice. This is like effortful, cognitively engaged practice, not just playing around or experimenting. And so they had averaged 10,000 hours of deliberate practice by age 20, which was more than the other 20 violinists. The thing is, none of them really did do 10,000 hours. It's like some of them did much more and some of them actually did less. So this average of 10,000, first of all, didn't really tell you anything about the reality of human skill development. And when eventually more of that data came out, it showed that there's this tremendous variance. Like some people got to expertise much faster and some people much slower. And that's kind of the story of skill development. So we've been talking about chess for a while, for example. there was a study in chess that looked at how long did it take people to get to international master status, which is one down from grandmaster. And the average was 11,053 hours. So in fact, the 10,000 hours rule would have been too little for that. But some people made it in 3,000 hours. And then some people were at 25,000 hours and they still hadn't made it. So first of all, what this impressed upon me, like the rest of skill development literature, is that you actually want to do some testing to figure out where your talents lie. Like, where are the areas that you learn quickly? And talent is a real thing. The 10,000 hours rule supposes that there is no such thing as talent, that everyone progresses the exact same amount at a given skill level from the same amount of practice. And this is just totally not true. Like, in almost anything but the simplest tasks in all of this skill acquisition literature. And so, first of all, it pays to spend time learning where you learn well, because then you'll progress faster. The second thing is just that this 10,000 hours, it was done in people learning how to play already composed classical music, right? Golf, chess, playing classical music, these are kind learning environments. So this idea, again, was extrapolated that you want to do this narrow, huge amount of practice in the exact same thing to get to expertise. But even the guy who did the 10,000 hour study, Anders Ericsson, eventually wrote a book. And in the book, it says, there's like a paragraph where he says, he was like the guru of practice in science. And there's a paragraph that says, by the way, this framework doesn't really apply to computer engineers, entrepreneurs, writers, blah, blah, blah. Like, he names almost all of the professions that almost all of us work in and says it doesn't really apply to those things. Of course, it had already been applied to all of those things. And the issue is, in these other, like, more creative, strategic domains, again, you actually want this, like, really broad toolbox, which allows you to do, again, that thing that psychologists call transfer, which is taking your skills and knowledge and applying it to new problems. And what allows you to do that, actually, there's a classic finding in psychology that can be summarized as breadth of training predicts breadth of transfer. Transfer, applying your skills and knowledge to problems you haven't quite seen, what most of us have to do constantly now. And what predicts your ability to do that well is the diversity of the types of problems that you've faced in your training, because it causes your brain to build these sort of general and flexible mental models where you're not saying, I've seen this exact problem before, I know the procedure to execute. It's like, I have a template that I think I can fit to this problem. And that's most of the work that most of us are doing a lot of the time now. And so the 10,000 hours idea can kind of really lead you astray and make you inflexible.
It's fascinating to hear. And I think also in terms of just understanding how it's a very freeing construct to hear, because then at the end of the day, me not meeting that requirement doesn't necessarily predict my success in this area. And I think that one of the graphs that also made me feel that way was seeing the early specializers versus the late specializers, and those early specializers having that head start. But over time, the late specializers tend to surpass them. Why does that happen?
I in fact think that that's like the theme that's on every page of Range, but that would have made an unmarketable subtitle, is that the things that you can do to optimize the short term, or head starts, will often undermine your long-term development, right? Whether that's picking a profession, or learning a new skill, or whatever it is, that sometimes what seems like a head start will undermine longer-term development. And so we talked about that a little bit in athletes, but like, to go to a realm that involves more people, I looked at some research in higher education, and this economist found a natural experiment in the higher ed systems of England and Scotland, which in the period he studied were really, really similar. The main difference being, in England, teenagers had to pick a specific area of study to specialize in, like in their mid-teen years, so they could test into a certain area of study. Where in Scotland, they could keep trying new things throughout college if they wanted to. And his question was, who usually wins this trade-off? And what he saw was that the early specializers jump out to an income lead, right? Income's not everything, not even close, but it is easy to measure. So they jumped out to an income lead. But the later specializers, they got to try more things. And when they did pick, they had higher, what economists call match quality, which is the degree of fit between your interests and your abilities and the work that you do. Turns out to be super important for your sense of fulfillment and your performance. So even though they started out behind because they had fewer kind of domain-specific skills when they graduated, they had better fit, so their growth rates were higher. By 6 years out, they surpassed the early specializers, the early specializers meanwhile started quitting their career tracks in much higher numbers, even though they had more disincentive from doing so, basically because they had been made to choose so early that they more often made poor choices, right? It's like they had to get married before they had done any dating, and that didn't often make the best choice for them. And now there's been even more work in that regard across about a dozen countries where people were matched for like their parents' years of education, their own education, their national test scores, etc. The difference was some get specialized and some get broader education. And it's the same pattern. Those with the more narrow early education, they get hired more quickly. They jump out to an income lead. They're less flexible over the course of their career. Their growth rates are slower. Eventually, the later specializers with the broader background surpass them in the long run. The problem is that's like really hard for us to get our head around, because normally when you see two people that are separated by a certain amount of skill or income or happiness or whatever at a given moment, you assume that that's like a stable trajectory forever, when in fact all of this development research shows that that's not the case.
It kind of reminds me a little bit about the idea of a T-shaped person. So I would love for you to explain that. Also, is that basically, would you consider that a hybrid of a generalist and a specialist? And do you think that that's the ideal that we should be aiming for, a T-shaped person?
Yeah, I would consider it. So a T-shaped person, so if you think of, just a pure specialist as an I-shaped person, right? It's like a line that's just going deep into one area. And the T-shaped person, which I think is now more valued in almost every industry. Like when I'm around companies and organizations, they're always talking about the T-shaped person, means that they do have an area where they have some expertise, that vertical line, but they also have a broader view and they know how to connect that expertise to all these other areas. So they may have some specialization to some degree, or they may have had in the past, but at a certain point, they sacrifice increasing specialization, like they could keep just going deep, in order to connect to these other areas and to have this broader view. And there's also, in addition to the T-shaped person, the pie-shaped person, right? The symbol pi, which has sort of two vertical lines and then a horizontal line. And I've been hearing that talked about more in companies as well, which is this idea that you can kind of come in and out of areas of specialization, right? So you have an area of depth, you come up and you establish some breadth. You expand your network, you expand your horizons, and then you can go into another area at some depth if you want, and you can come up again. And I think increasingly that's how successful careers are being made, where it's like it's doing what is classically called, again in the research, explore and exploit. Explore means looking for new knowledge or broadening your network or connecting to new areas, where exploit is just drilling down on the knowledge and skills and network that you already have. And the successful career seems to be a toggling between these, of explore and exploit. And the problem is, a lot of times people are just focused on exploit, right? Getting some knowledge and using it as quickly as possible. In fact, there was just a really cool study that came out too recently for Rain to get into the book about how people set themselves up for career hot streaks. So this study was too recent to get into the book, but it was led by this researcher at Northwestern named Dashan Wong, who does these fascinating studies. And he had found in previous work that most people do their best professional work in a streak, as he called a hot streak, like that your best work will come in a row in succession. And some people have two, most people only have one. Some people kind of have none, where they don't have like this series of work that's like beyond the other stuff that they've done. And he looked at, I think it was 26,000 directors, so some of your peers, artists, and scientists. And what he saw was that a hot streak was reliably predicted by a period of exploration beforehand. So in a scientist, for example, what you'd see is, hey, they're working with small teams in different areas. So kind of quicker projects where they can try a bunch of different things. And then maybe they nail something where they're like, now this is where I want to drill down. And then they move to like a larger team and they stop like jumping around areas. Or an artist who's kind of testing different styles, and then they find like a mix that fits, and then they really drill down on that. And so the best predictor of a hot streak in work was a period of exploration beforehand. And so Dashin's main advice was most of us are probably not experimenting enough at work, and we're skipping into the drill down before we've really done sufficient exploration.
That is incredibly fascinating, and it actually makes complete sense, because especially in the artistic world, in order for you to be creative, you almost need to just expose yourself. Like anytime I sit down to write, I have to basically expose myself to anything similar that I think I could draw inspiration from, or more importantly, from my own life, right? And the more stagnant I've been, the less inspired I feel. And it makes me think of someone very well known, Taylor Swift. And I thought about her when I was reading, because you talk about all these other musicians who were playing other instruments, right? And it made a really strong case for generalism when I was reading it. But then you look at someone like Taylor Swift, and on one hand, you can call her a specialist because she's a musician, right? And then when you look closer, she's a songwriter, a performer, a marketer, she's a storyteller. And so I'm curious, when it comes to anyone that's watching that has maybe that one specific dream, maybe they want to be a musician or an artist or a singer, are they still considered a generalist if they're exploring with different skill sets, like the ones in your book of different genres, whatever it may be? Or do you have to leave that domain in order for you to actually have that broad range of expertise and experience?
That's a great question. And it gets to an issue that is at least impossible for me to answer perfectly, which is this issue of generalist specialist is like very much a semantic thing, right? Like in the research about technological innovation, sometimes generalist and specialist is categorized by how many different types of technology has someone worked with, right? But in other areas, there's not an easy metric for saying like what is broad and what is narrow. And to your point about moving within or between industries, well, I went to grad school in sciences, and when I left science, a path to become a scientist, and I ended up working at Sports Illustrated magazine, and my peers who were still in science then saw me as a generalist, right? I'd gone from science to Sports Illustrated, whereas my peers at Sports Illustrated who were like, oh, this is like the science writer, saw me as the specialist, right? And so some of it depends on the milieu. And I should say, like when I arrived at Sports Illustrated, I arrived as a temp fact checker, like 5-6 years, because I was career changing, 5-6 years older than people I was doing like basic work for. And I thought, well, I did the science thing and it wasn't what I wanted to do with my life. That's good to know, but I kind of wasted that time. But pretty soon I realized that actually, I was shaping up to be a fine scientist. Maybe I was going to be average. I don't know. But my average science skills, then you bring them to a sports magazine where nobody else has those. And it's like, like you're like a Nobel laureate or something. Because you take these skills that are taken for granted in one area and you bring it somewhere where it's seen as incredible innovation. And that basically became the story of the rest of my career. But it gets to that point of whether you're defined as a generalist or a specialist, except in few cases where research actually measures it with some metric, has a lot to do with the people around you and how they see you. And your point about Taylor Swift, I mean, yeah, she's kind of an everything, right? She's like a community builder and like an incredible entrepreneur. But when I think of her music career, I think I first heard of her as a country singer. And that's certainly not how I think of her now as a country singer, even though there's that influence, of course. Like, I think getting exposure to how problems are solved in multiple industries is valuable. And I see that when I'm invited to speak at like conferences for associations or companies, that they have this incredible desire to get insight into how some other industry solves similar problems. That's why they love like hearing talks from athletes or dancers or pilots or whatever, because they know those people don't know their industry or their business, but they're like, how does that person approach practice? How does that person manage stress? How does that person choose teammates, right? They're like hungry. High performers are like hungry for solutions from other industries. And in fact, by the way, it's shown that one of the reasons that cities cause people to be so innovative is that people from different industries mingle and solutions kind of jump from one industry to another. So I think it's beneficial for people to have at least a network that extends beyond their own industry so they can understand how others approach, all those like fundamental problems. But that said, I think most people could have a really good start by doing some experimentation I think most people are probably under experimenting even within their own kind of domain.
Yeah, no, I think that that is incredibly true. And I think of so many people that I know that are also within our creative industry that really do think that they go by the 10,000 hour rule, they go by that. And then at the end of the day, when I really think of myself, when I think of the decisions that I've made in my own career, I look to the people that have understood. I mean, we made a whole video about like me starting our business made me realize for years I was saying I'm not a business person, I'm a creative. And being an entrepreneur I can't even tell you how much of a better creative I am because I now understand business and I understand marketing. I can now not only sell my art better, but I can understand how to structure things, and I can structure my business better because I understand how film sets work. And I think one of the parts that, I put a lot of green highlighter around, you talk about these Nobel laureates and how the highest performers, they don't narrow their creative pursuits and they actually expand them. And I would love for you to expand on this one part. I have it notated here. It appears as though they are scattering and dissipating their energies, while in reality they are channeling and strengthening them. And I would love for you to expand on this and why you felt it was important to mention that in the book.
By the way, to your point that you said your peers mentioned the 10,000 hour rule, they work by that 10,000 hour rule. To the extent that that means practice is important, like fine. That is totally uncontroversial, right? If it means you have to pick something and stick with it and shouldn't pivot despite all the things you're learning, that you shouldn't search for your talents, or that you've started too late if you didn't focus in on one thing, then that is not supported by the research. But that quote you mentioned was from a Nobel laureate, actually, writing about how scientists develop and the fact that, like, Nobel laureate scientists are about 22 times more likely than their peers to have a serious aesthetic hobby, doing magic, woodworking, glass blowing, painting, music, all these things. And that turns out to be like a pretty typical thing of high performers, that they have an identity that's like also separate from just their work, and they have like another place to turn and other things to try. And in fact, again, this was research that came out too recently for me to get into range, but another study of Nobel laureates found that they actually hit career in sciences, they hit career benchmarks slower than their peers, because early on they want to be interdisciplinary. And so they often get tenure later than their peers because they're being more interdisciplinary and they're kind of punished for it. So again, it's a case of building this broad toolbox early, people seeing that as getting behind, and then it becoming super powerful in the long run. Of course, my concern about it is that how many people are, given that there's a disincentive from doing it, how many Nobel laureates have we not developed because they felt, I shouldn't do that? The most innovative thinkers are part of a wider world. They're always connecting their information to other domains. And they build a really incredible network of collaborators. Like, this is kind of random, but the scientists that just won the Nobel Prize, Katalin Karikó and Drew Weissman for mRNA, which led to COVID vaccines, they met while waiting in line for a photocopier and started talking about their work. And if you read the Nobel lectures year after year, it's like always something of serendipity where someone's at lunch and they talk to someone who sparks an idea, right? And so I think part of it is just having pursuits that diversify your network and get you in sort of a different mindset. And so I think it's a problem when people only take lunch to their desk every day and aren't doing that kind of mingling that sometimes leads to a Nobel Prize.
Oh my God, it's fascinating. And again, it's very freeing to hear that. Let's talk about quitting. When, we're taught the winners never quit. And I am I'm guilty of being one of those people that repeats that quote over and over and over. And you argue that it's not that winners never quit, it's that they actually quit often. And I would love for you to explain, what is the difference between strategic quitting and just giving up?
Yeah, because I'm not pro quitterness, like being a quitter. Like, I'm a diligent person. I think quitting needs a rebrand because that word is so loaded. So let me give an example of a different way to think about it, which I spent some time with the Army when I was writing the book. And I got some insight into these programs they were developing because they had started losing all these recruits that they had identified as really talented, and those people were leaving. And so in an attempt to keep them, they started new development programs, like one called talent-based branching. Okay. And talent-based branching just meant instead of taking these cadets and saying, here's your career track, get up or out, which was the traditional way, they said, we're going to pair you with kind of a coach-like mentor person, and you're going to try a career track. You're going to reflect, you're going to dabble in it, reflect on how it fits you with your mentor. You got to explicitly track those reflections, keep track of them in an online portal. And we're going to make you do that through at least 5 different career tracks. You have to dip a toe into them and dabble. And the cadets who went through talent-based branching, 90% of them changed their career preference. 90%, just by having this opportunity to sample a little bit. And they ended up staying in their careers longer when throwing money at them to stay had not worked. What did work was helping them find a better career fit. And so as one of the researchers who did this work told me, he said, when you get fit, it looks like grit. Like if you get someone in a situation that better fits them, they will display these characteristics like persistence and perseverance and sticking to it, even if they didn't before. And so that, to me, that talent-based branching program is basically a strategic coached quitting program. But they give it a fancy name like talent-based branching. So it's not like, oh, you're trying this career track and then you quit that and then you quit this other thing. Wait, you've quit 3 different career tracks? Like you are a quitter. Instead, it's like, no, this is talent-based branching. Strategic exploration to find, where your interests and abilities fit. And so I think it needs a rebrand. And I think we all need to have these habits of mind that are called self-regulatory learning, which means thinking about your own thinking. So in Range, I write about the Dark Horse Project, this study at Harvard that studied people who find fulfilling work. And it's called the Dark Horse Project because not all of them, but the large majority had these winding paths where they would say, well, I did this and then I left that and then I did this other thing and I found my way in this really unusual pattern. So don't tell anybody to do what I did because I kind of came out of nowhere. Dark Horse means someone who came out of nowhere. There were people who had followed just a linear, more tiger-like path, but they were the small minority. And the habit of mind that these people who zigzagged their way to fulfillment had was, instead of saying, here's who's younger than me and has more than me, they'd say, here are my opportunities right now. Here are my skills and interests. I'm going to take this one. And maybe a year from now, I'll change because I will have learned something about myself. And then they just keep triangulating that way, saying, oh, this didn't meet my expectations in this way, but I learned I'm good at this one thing. Can I take it to this other move? And they do that strategic pivoting until they, and I think this is a lifelong process, until they keep finding better and better match quality for their work. So I think having that habit of mind of like being willing to change based on your life experience, like if you frame it in the sense that I should pick a thing and despite what I learn, I should stick to it, then it sounds stupid, So I think we just need a rebrand, basically, of smart pivoting.
I think what's so fascinating is, as I was reading, I was finding myself feeling uncomfortable because, again, it's like I still consider myself to be a director. I don't even want to stop ever to think that I'm not continuing down that path. I just kind of look at it as I'm going this way. I see that there's a little bit of a traffic jam here and I can't get to it. So I'm just going to have to, continue going this way. I still direct, but again, going to the level that I want to direct and, have a feature film, I'm like, okay, well, maybe if I create, an audience and we do this way with our company and then I could fund it myself, maybe I'll do it that way and I kind of go this way, right? I know there's so many people who are listening that maybe they're not in their early 20s. It's very easy to, maybe feel more comfortable with exploration in your 20s. But I think at a certain point we start reaching this, your 30s, your 40s, your 50s, even your 60s, you think that at that point it's like, well, I chose, this is kind of what I have to continue doing. I've made my peace, I've made my choice, this is where I'm at. What do you say to those people who feel that real pressure to specialize and continue down that path? And how do you reconcile that of making that choice to potentially quit at a later point in your life?
First of all, I would say that you can learn new things at older ages than people previously thought. So a lot of the idea that you can't get good at something when you're older is not true. It was just like a stigma. And there are certain things like if you want to change your native language, you better be doing it before age 12. But for a lot of things, people could get better at them than they think. But they get somewhat competent at something and then they stick with it no matter what, right? Because it's scary to start something new. And I think part of what makes it quite scary is the feeling that you have to take a flying leap. The image that people have if they're going to do something new is like of the old Superman movies where, I haven't seen the new one, so I don't know if it's in there too, but like where Clark Kent would dash into a phone booth and like rip open his shirt and come out as Superman, you know? And that's totally not how it is. Like in Range, I talk about the research of a woman named Herminia Ibarra at the London Business School, and she followed people through successful career transitions, sometimes the same person through multiple career transitions. And what she saw was that they often had this idea that like you have to take a flying leap or don't do it, when in fact the reality of changes was someone would have a conversation or attend a class or whatever and get like a little inspired or curious about something, and then they'd learn a little more and they'd get a little more invested, and it would be this slow piece by piece transition, and then eventually they'd say, all right, I think my work identity kind of needs to change. But it was never a flying leap. And so I think people are deterred because they think this idea has to be like, I'm one person on one day and then I change who I am tomorrow. But work is part of identity, and identity doesn't change overnight. And the reality is that it usually happens as tiny, starting with a keyhole view into some other possibility of your future self. And then you build a little at a time. She wrote a book called Working Identity that tracks some of these people. And I think if we view it as this smaller piecemeal process, not a jump off a cliff, it would be a lot less intimidating and people would feel, less deterred.
I wrote something that was a note to myself that I feel like is the thing that shifted in me from this. And I think where especially with going with the anatomy of a dream, right? Where I realized, I put, do not let the version of the dream you had in mind get in the way of who you're meant to become. Great quote.
I love it. May I ask how old you are?
31. I just turned 31.
So happy birthday. There's this thing called the end of history illusion that I think people should be aware of. That's this finding in psychology that if you ask people, have you learned a lot and changed a lot based on your experiences? Everyone, of course, says yes, right? But then if you ask, are you going to change a lot in the future? Like, well, no, now I think I pretty much know who I am, right? And at every time point in life, we underestimate future change. What you value in friends, how you want the world to be, how you spend your time, and all this stuff, your hairstyle, if you ever look at old pictures. We're works in progress, constantly claiming to be finished. And the fastest time of personality change is from about 18 to about 28 or so. So you're like just getting out of that. So it slows down, but it never stops throughout life, ever. And so the idea that we arrive at a certain place as finished, I think is a fallacy, and that we should expect to have different interests and abilities and values as we go through life. And so expect to update what you think you should be doing with yourself, because it's not the same self, right? Especially in that period of 18 to late 20s, where we're often telling people now you have to have it figured out. That's like we're telling them to choose something for a person they don't know yet in a world they can't imagine. So I think it's taking this much more shorter term of here's who I am right now. I'm going to be different, so I should be willing to pivot is like a powerful mindset.
Thank you for it. Seriously, it genuinely, I think, has that part for me has been something I feel like was what I'm saying. It changed. I feel like that section to me did not stand and resonate in the same way that it does today, just even in a few years, right? And it's crazy to see how, I'm not the same person, right? Like the things that I started to feel just the second I turned 30 started to change, especially as a woman, and with all of these things that I want to get done before starting a family. It's like you start thinking about these things that, and just 2 years ago, I wasn't really thinking about them in the same way that I am today. So you're right, we change so much. But I am curious because there are people I know that, I could define them almost as being a little scattered, right? Where it feels almost a little directionless. How far is too far in the going in the generalism route? Is there a line between being a too generalist or too scattered? And how do you know when your range is working for you versus when it's pulling away from your real progress?
Yeah, this is like an issue of are you a generalist or are you a dilettante, right? Where you're just like scraping the surface on tons of different things. And I think both things can happen. And I don't think there's a perfect answer. But I was again, when I got involved in reporting on the military, I also ended up getting involved with the Pat Tillman Foundation, which was this foundation named for Pat Tillman was a NFL player who left in the middle of his career to join the Army and was killed in Afghanistan. And the foundation, endowed by his widow, gives money for career development or education to soldiers, military veterans, and spouses. And I was put on the selection committee for the people who would get these like very prestigious grants. So it's like me and some like 3-star generals, you know, but they wanted some civilians in it. And we had to rate all the applications individually and then as a group. And what you'd see is the people that I would call the zigzaggers, you know, the generalists, would end up on both tails of the score distribution. They'd end up with the worst scores, and they would also end up being a lot of the winners. And when we'd get their application package, like I'd look at it, and even knowing what I know, right? Like I wrote range, but also I'm human and subject to the same cognitive biases as everybody else is. So I would see the zigzaggers, all this like different stuff on their resume, and be like, ugh, this person's kind of all over the place. Like, even knowing what I know, that's my first reaction. But then for some of them, you would, let's say like a hypothetical candidate, they go to high school or college, they get some job, they hate it, they join the military, they end up in some remote area administering medical care or translating or whatever they're doing. They realize maybe they have leadership skills they didn't expect. They realize maybe they're bad at some other thing they hoped they'd be good at. They realize there are problems they want to address, or technological gaps or social gaps that they want to address. And they come back and they shift directions because of the stuff they've learned. And when those people explained that as this narrative journey of I did this and then I went that way, it was like a light bulb went on in the committee where it would go from like, ooh, this person's scattered to that's exactly what we want. This is a learner. You know, this person is seeking out opportunity where they're going to matter. Whereas the zigzaggers who just kind of said, I did this stuff in the past and now I'm doing this thing, they would end up with the worst scores. So some of them turned a liability into an asset, and those were most of the winners. So I think the issue was those people were constantly retelling their story to themselves and saying, what did I learn here and how am I going to use that for my pivot, versus just being like, well, that I just figured out that's not a thing I want to do and now I'm going to do this other thing. And I think this should be explicit, this self-regulatory learning where you're always thinking about your thinking. Like, have a journal. Answer this. I did this when I was trying to write my first book. A scientist told me to take, who studied this self-regulatory learning, he said, take a journal, take these questions. It was like, I do this in a different way now, but at first it was, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to learn? Why do you want to learn it or do it? Are you sure you want to? Who do you need to help you do that? How are you going to make sure that that person is accessible so you can do it? What's the first experiment you're going to run? What's the first thing you're going to try? How are you going to test if it's working? And she was like, answer these every month. I'm like, but I'll answer these the same every month. I never answered them the same way twice. And it really got me in this mode of always kind of running little experiments of myself and saying, what's the next thing I want to learn? And so I think if you're someone who either wants to be a generalist by choice or zigzags because you haven't found your thing, be in that mindset of the way you were talking about it. When you talked about your own career, it's like very clear that nothing was wasted, right? You took these things and you figured out how to cobble them together in a new experience. And I think that's the difference between bouncing around kind of randomly and pivoting based on the things you're learning about yourself and your opportunities.
That is phenomenal. And my last question actually is so relevant to what you just said. So it was perfect because it's about resumes. You know, there's this core anxiety, for generalists, is because I keep hearing, especially in this research, it's not as marketable as, as being a specialist,
Yeah.
right? So when it comes to resumes, what is the advice for the jack of all trades? Is it the story, telling the story in the resume? How do you do that in a resume to make sure that, in a world that wants to put them in a box, that their resume is, somehow competitive to the person that has 20 years in that thing that they're looking for?
Yeah, this is a huge problem, right? Because like in Range, I talk about the work of Abby Griffin on serial innovators. These are people who make just repeated creative contributions. And when she describes these people, it's like they read more and more broadly than their peers. They have a need to learn in multiple domains. They have a need to network in domains with expertise that are different from their own. They connect things from lots of different areas, et cetera, et cetera. They appear to flit among ideas. They tend to have hobbies, et cetera. And you can almost hear her writing to HR people like, dear HR people, when you define a job too narrowly, you just make sure you select these people out, right? Or you don't allow them to develop. And that's a huge problem. So to the extent that you are able, I would incorporate that storytelling, because it can really make something that looks like a liability into an asset. That's, here's what I did. here's what I learned about myself in that experience. And that can often be, I learned I was bad at something I expected to be good at. But also I learned I had an interest or ability that I didn't expect. And then I took that to this next move. And I think when you frame it in that way, like so many employers I hear talk about have such a headache in feeling that some of their people aren't good at thinking about their own strengths and weaknesses. So if you can show that I did this thing and I was thinking about I was concentrating on what are my own strengths and weaknesses and how will that inform my next move, I think that really telegraphs to employers that you're thoughtful in a way that's incredibly in demand.
The thing that is so empowering for me, especially with the business that we've seen, is that we don't really look for specialists because we can't really carry that. I mean, we can hire them as freelancers, but to really have them internally as full-time, I mean, every single person in this chat at our company, they are all jack of all trades, and they're here because of that. And I think that at the end of the day, I think that is so impactful to hear what you're saying, how you carry that skill stacking of how you bring it into that next
skill
thing.
Stacking.
Exactly. It really is so, it is really the way I think to stand out is to, I mean, my major in undergrad was psychology, and I thought I was going to be a lawyer with that. And I decided to do that because I didn't like political science. And I was like, I can go to law school with a psychology degree. And I remember my father being like, what are you doing? You're spending my money and you don't even know what you want. And it is the most useful degree. I mean, even reading your book, I just felt like this just reminds me of why I fell in love with psychology. And I feel like I can understand people better. I'm a better business person. I'm a better director because of it. And it was this perfect mashup of what I had studied when I wasn't intentional about it. I just studied it because I liked it. It was the only time that I remember just being in a science class and being like, oh my God, this is so fun. And I think that following that curiosity and making sense of it later, like Steve Jobs talks about connecting the dots, is a huge part, I think, of why range stands out to me, because it makes sense of what I think we all kind of want to do anyway, which is experience life and try different things. And that's the point of being a human being, right? And I think you made it make sense and you backed it up. So I feel like people can move forward with confidence into accomplishing their dreams and meeting their future selves and becoming and reaching their fullest potential because of this book and because of the work that you've done.
I really appreciate that, and that's eloquently put. And by the way, I majored in geology and minored in astronomy, and have a master's degree in environmental science. And those things turned out to be insanely useful because so much of my career ended up being made by picking out kind of science that wasn't very well done and turning that into something that I was going to start harping on, basically. And that came from my science background. So when I was writing the book, I'm thinking I'm writing about performance, because I've been used to, my previous book was about high performance. And so much of the reaction to the book, though, has been people saying I felt seen, which is not exactly what I expected, but that I'm really heartened by, right? Because to your point, there are clearly all these people that want to be broad, if they don't feel that they're disincentivized from it, but sort of felt like generalist or whatever it is was a dirty word. And so I'm just really gratified by that reaction of people saying I feel seen, even though it wasn't what I was going for. But I love it.
When you find pieces of work like this that can allow you to move through life with a little bit more confidence and a lot less of that pressure, I think it really just changes, I think, the trajectory of your life. I mean, I can just tell you, it has impacted me greatly. And I really appreciate the work that you've done. Sorry, I'm getting emotional. I'm just really appreciative.
That's also wonderful of you to say, and the most gratifying thing a writer can hear when I'm away in my own head for 2 years, not knowing if any of the stuff's going to resonate. So that's incredible to hear.
Well worth it. It was well worth it. And I mean, literally, I'm telling you, I feel bad. I kind of butchered your book because it's literally just
no, that's like a writer's dream. And you mentioned the Jack of all trades episode. So you got the Jack of all trades quote story. Do you know that stuff that I stuck in afterward only for the...
Oh, yes. Would you mind mentioning it real quick?
Sure. So the phrase Jack of all trades, Jack of all trades, master of none. The full version is actually Jack of all trades, master of none, oftentimes better than master of one. But I think it's culturally telling that we hacked off the back end. And a fun fact is that the first use of Jack of all trades as an insult, first recorded use at least, was in New Latin, Johannes factotum. And it was an insult that was leveled at a young poet who didn't have formal education, was trying to be an actor and a playwright and run a theater company, all this different stuff. And that was a young William Shakespeare. So the literal first use of jack of all trades as an insult was leveled at a young William Shakespeare who turned out okay. And so I think that's a hilarious origin story.
And it shows that we've been grappling with this concept of generalist or specialist for a much longer time than I think we thought.
Absolutely.
And I have to ask if there's anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to bring up, or if there's anything that you're working on to expand your range right now that you want to mention.
Well, first of all, it's just like delightful to talk to someone who read the book so deeply. So thank you for that. As Jorge Luis Borges said, good readers are more rare than good writers. So I'm always grateful for them. What I'm working on, I'm finishing up another book that addresses some natural next questions from range, that some of which you kind of touched on, which is partly involved with like not ending up as a dilettante, right? Like you get these broad experiences and broad skill set. At some point you have to focus that into something. And so the book is about useful constraints, like when constraints can be helpful for, obviously constraints can be bad in many ways, that goes without saying, but when they can be useful for creativity, for innovation, for personal contentment. And like all of my books, there's a heavy element of me search in this, which is that I'm a generalist and I'm attracted to these like amorphous ideas that I want to write about. And I have often done a poor job of drawing boundaries around my own ideas. And so the projects have gotten too expansive, or I've had to write 150% of the book to cut back to get 100% of a book. And so I wanted to get better at kind of setting boundaries around projects myself. So that's what it's about. But it's not out until May of next year.
Well, we will have it on our calendars, ready to go. David, thank you.
Thank you.
We've got a giveaway for you, just for our dream team who stuck around until the end of this conversation. So one of you is going to get a copy of David's book, Range. To enter the giveaway, comment down below which part of this conversation shocked you the most, and we will be announcing the winner next week. And if you want to watch our full, in-depth analysis of whether you should be a generalist or a specialist to attain your dreams, because there are exceptions, watch this video right here on the screen. Wait, is that what you meant? Oh, okay. Sebastian's like this, and I'm just like, I just like imitate. I was like, okay, bye. All right, guys, I'll see you in the next one.